I will go straight to the key issues requiring urgent attention. But before that, the background is what most of us know about our macroeconomic indicators and the performance of the economy, which has headed south. We have a large unemployment rate, 33.3%, which is one of the highest since independence. We have inflation in excess of 20% today. An exchange rate that is fast losing value. In the streets today, the dollar exchanges to about 700 naira or thereabout. And of course, we have issues around oil theft, as well as increased PMS consumption and the subsidy, which are the big elephants in the room. So the first issue we have here is that of fuel consumption, which is recorded at 65 million liters a day, although in some quarters they talk about 68 million liters a day. But we have empirical evidence to demonstrate that Nigeria may not necessarily be consuming 65 million liters a day, because since 2015 we are doing about 35 million liters a day, and since then we passed through 2 recessions, heightened insecurity, massive factory closures, and high unemployment rate, and we believe that energy consumption is inextricably linked to economic activities and growth, because the more economic activities you have, the more energy you consume. And we recall that in 2013 to 2015, when the consumption was 35 million liters, series of probes were held in the National Assembly and in the Executive, and all of them boiled down to the fact that those figures were inflated, and some people were even prosecuted. So we do not understand the basis for adding 30 million liters when we have gone through recessions and massive factory closures thereafter. So our recommendation is that there should be an open and transparent public inquiry to determine the actual PMS consumption, on the basis of which a final subsidy decision will be made. That there is prima facie evidence to indicate that the figures turned out by NNPC Limited are inflated. The second one is on the fuel subsidy. The information at our disposal indicates that we pay out 18.4 billion a day in fuel subsidy. And in the 2023-2025 MTF, 2 scenarios are presented. One is that the subsidy remains, which means at the end of 2023, we will have spent 6.72 trillion. The second scenario is that the subsidy will remain up till mid-2023, which is at the end of the current administration, which means we will only pay half of 6.72, which is 3.36 trillion. In our view, the first scenario is out of it. We cannot be thinking of having a deficit, which means we are going to borrow money, of 11.3 trillion in 2023. And if you use the proposed exchange rate of 435.57 to the dollar, the subsidy, proposed full year subsidy, comes up to $15.428 billion. And this sum from our investigation is sufficient to build a 500,000 barrels per day brand new refinery. Now the second scenario we think is a refusal of the current administration to take responsibility for hard decisions to address fiscal challenges. They are postponing decision making on fuel subsidy to the next administration. Paying it until mid-2023 means that we'll be spending $7.714 billion, or 3.360 trillion. Our recommendation: start the process of gradual through phased subsidy removal over a period of 2 years. Remove 50% in the first year and the remaining 50% in the second year. Engage organized labor, the private sector and the public in good faith disclosure and negotiations with relevant information, and design a social intervention program to cushion the hardship in critical sectors like transport, agriculture, and food. Then take steps to conclude the revitalization of existing refineries and thereafter run them efficiently. In the alternative, concession or privatize them after the repairs and turnaround maintenance. The proposed private sector participation should be done under a process that is transparent, guarantees value for money, and ensures that the firms that will get the concession have technical, financial, and managerial capacity to run the refineries. On no account should be taken over the management of the refineries be allowed to engage in assets stripping. We've seen the privatization of the power sector, and the major challenge is that those who took it over, particularly the discos, did not meet up to these core requirements of core investors, which is technical capacity, financial capacity, and managerial capacity. From the one, they started borrowing money from the banks at very high interest rates, and that is what is leading us to the suboptimal performance of that sector, because they didn't have the resources to invest in the power sector. And lastly, transparently support Dangote refinery to start production at the earliest possible time. The key word is transparently. We are not saying giving money that should come from the treasury. Even if you are giving him money, it should be a loan which he has to pay back, and the public should know about the terms of how it should happen. Oil thefts. Available information indicates 400,000 barrels at least a day is lost. At the current price of crude, this translates to $1.2 billion per month and $14.4 billion per annum, which is 6.272 trillion. This sum, when brought into the books of an NPC Limited, will increase its profits and the dividends to be paid by governments. However, from the reports of Nigeria's August 2022 oil production, as reported by Mr. President himself, we produce less than 1 million barrels, about 972,000 barrels per day. And so the theft may have escalated beyond the challenge of 400,000 barrels a day. And we also have a publicized contract of 4 billion a month given to the warlord Tompolo. And we don't think it is proper, and it may not solve the challenge. Comparative experience and previous budgetary votes show that technology can be deployed to solve the oil theft. Our recommendations: reduce oil theft and vandalization to a minimum by holding accountable officers under whose watch industrial scale oil theft occurs. Demand value for money in the Tompolo pipeline protection contract and similar contracts. Consider the removal of the leadership of an NPC under whose watch this stealing has escalated. In the alternative, FGN should set clear theft reduction targets for the leadership of an NPC and the security agencies. The fourth one, consider a certification and authentication system, a pipeline integrity program strategy that traces Nigeria's crude oil from the wells to the refineries as a means of eradicating oil theft. We can draw lessons in designing this program from the experience of blood diamonds. And then activate the real-time online monitoring of pipelines and strategic oil and gas resources paid for in federal budgets between 2020, 2010 and 2014. If this facility is not available, hold to account individuals and institutions that drew down appropriated votes without delivering any value. If you go to the budgets between 2010 and 2014, there were votes for real-time online monitoring of oil and gas facilities. And indeed, on Arise Television a couple of days ago, somebody came from an NPC to talk about those facilities. And some of you may have watched a similar facility in Saudi Arabia where they could monitor all their oil and gas pipelines from their control room, including ships laden with Saudi oil in the high seas. They had an idea of wherever each one of them is at any given point in time. Then the oil price benchmark. The fiscal projections in the MTF still include oil price benchmark and oil production in millions of barrels a day. At a time, NNPC has become a limited liability company and is no longer under obligation to simply sell crude oil and remit the proceeds to the Federation account for sharing by the trade tiers of government. The implication is that an MPC can only remit profits at the end of a year or at agreed intervals. And it's acknowledged, we acknowledge that the quantum and price of crude oil sold are important considerations in the profitability of an MPC. However, the most important consideration is that profits is not necessarily tied to the price of crude. The company will pay for investments and other business outgoings before it can return the profits. Furthermore, not all profits will be distributed as dividends, as the company will still be entitled to retain some part of it for future investments. So our recommendation is that the fiscal framework should be reworked based on a forecast of an MPC's profitability, rather over the medium term, rather than based on millions of barrels produced a day. For instance, an MPC saying they are going to do an initial public offer to raise money by the middle of next year. So that company that is thinking of an IPO means that they are still looking for resources. So the challenge is that if they sell crude oil and make what amounts to some profit, they will still hold back some. They will not remit all of it to the Federation account for sharing. So we should focus more on a forecast of their profitability. The fourth issue is tax expenditure. As you can see on page 7, you can see the totals that we have forgone in 2020 and 2021 and the projection for 2022 and 2023. And we excluded tax credits under the road infrastructure credit scheme from these details. So in 2020, we had to forgo 5.664 trillion tax that was due. In 2021, we left out 4.74 trillion. And in 2022, this year, we are going to forgo 5.304 trillion. And all these years, if you look at the actual retained revenue, particularly of the federal government, you will discover that it is about the same figure. So it's like our entire revenue to come was 10 trillion. We left out about 5 and kept only 5. Now, if you look at the one for 2022, in the first quarter, up to April, we made only about 1.6 trillion. If you were to prorate 1.6 for time, which is 12 divided by 4, so that should be 1 over 1.3, one third. If 1.6 you multiply it by 3, what are you likely to get? 1.6 by 3. What's that figure? Should be about 4 points. So, and we are proposing to forgo 5.3. When all the revenue, the actual that will come this year, may be about 4.8 or thereabout. So you can see the folly. At a time we are borrowing money, looking for money to pay salaries, that we are foregoing much more revenue than the federal government is returning. Between 2020 and 2022, a total of 16.4 trillion was foregone as tax expenditure, while FGM and states continue to pile up the 16.4 trillion 2020 to 2022. So the proposal to give away 5.204 trillion in 2023 against a projected revenue of 8.46 trillion, while incurring 11.3 trillion deficit, is difficult to reconcile under fiscal responsibility rules. And if you look at section 29(1) of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, it is clear. It says if you are going to have a tax expenditure proposal, you should accompany it by an evaluation of how it impacts on your budget and finances and revenues in the year it becomes operational and in 2 or 3 subsequent years. And if it is going to adversely impact on your revenue, you show us what is called countervailing measures. Where are the new sources of revenue to plug that leakage? Where else will you get money to make sure you fund your budget? No borrowing, which is a new revenue source. But I can tell you very well that I've never seen any document, and I don't know who here has seen one, which shows a compliance with this section of the law, which shows us, an evaluation of how all these tax waivers will infer on our revenue and what we are going to do to get new money to do that. So the recommendation is that we should amend the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And we can do this through the Finance Act of 2022 because every year they have a Finance Act accompanying the budget. And we remove the power to grant tax expenditure from the minister or the executive. But then give the minister and the executive a duty to document their recommendations and proposals for tax expenditure and the justifications for those recommendations. But the power of approval should be left to the legislature. And secondly, we should cap tax expenditure to not more than 10% of projected revenue every year or within a medium term. So if the executive comes and says all the money we'll get is 10 trillion for 2023, we cap tax expenditure at not more than 1 trillion. And then you know the cases that are most justified and give the tax expenditure through a collaboration between the executive and the legislature. Number 6, independent revenue. We also noticed in that second scenario of fuel subsidy, the federal government said they were going to become more tight and increase the performance management oversight over the framework of the income and expenditure of government-owned enterprises. Over the years, these GOEs have not returned sufficient funds to justify their investment. Most of their managers do not manage them well, so that what is due to the Treasury is usually frittered away. Under the Finance Act of last year, government pegged that GOEs must not spend more than 50% of all their income. They will spend 50% and return 50% to the Treasury. And so, happily this year, considering calls from civil society over the years, they've agreed to, which is part of our recommendations, that all GOEs will now mandatorily be on a Treasury single account, where all their income and expenditure will be oversighted by the Accountant General and the Ministry of Finance. And in that case, we are saying, don't wait for a remittance. If you have access to seeing all their income, all you do is that maybe at the end of a month or a quarter, you do a deduction. You don't wait for them to remit, so that they don't tell you stories. You don't even make it available. You can have computer programs and software that will make sure that if GOE puts in 100 million, 50 is no longer available to them. So, if any government-owned enterprise say what is deducted is too much or is not in accordance with the rules, they can come back for reconciliation. And of course, we also recommended prosecution and administrative sanctions for unauthorized use of funds due to FGN as operating surplus. Exchange rates. Of course, everybody knows that our exchange rate is depreciating and there's a huge gap between the official exchange rates and what the rate is on the streets. By the official exchange rate today, and what is it on the streets, there is an arbitrage of about 300 naira per dollar you sell. So we are calling for an exchange rate adjustment to close the gap between the official and other exchange rates, ultimately increasing productivity and local value addition, leading to economic growth and increased exports, which shows the value of the naira. We also looked at issues of waste and improper expenditure. You will recall recently, ICPC documented a lot of budget padding. And over the years, we've also been compiling what we call frivolous, inappropriate, and wasteful expenditure. And so, the recommendation is that the National Assembly should open up the budget process so that before the budgets are approved, anti-corruption agencies and civil society and other critical stakeholders can infuse and look at those expenditure needs so that we can discover them before they are approved and take them out of the budget. And of course, those that scale that hurdle by any chance, a full implementation of the Public Procurement Act, open contracting, and value for money procedures will eventually weed them out. Sectoral funds. Two key sectoral funds we dealt with, health and housing. In housing, we have a new National Health Insurance Authority Act, which has made health insurance compulsory and mandatory for every Nigerian. And this is in response to our out-of-pocket expenditure, which is 70.52%. Much more than the sub-Saharan African average of less than 30%. So, the new law wants to reduce out-of-pocket health expenditure in Nigeria so that we'll have some form of health security and a strong movement towards universal health coverage. And so it has also provided what is called equity funds, where governments, the private sector, and critical stakeholders have to make use for payment of premiums to persons who are poor and indigent who cannot afford the commercial premiums. But we are looking at recommendations that since we now have a National Health Insurance Authority, and they are supposed to be a governing council, a policy council, which has not been put in place, we are asking the president to constitute the council. And we are saying that the governing council should take policy steps to ensure that the mandatory health insurance scheme is activated, because that law is on paper. The National Health Insurance Authority says that less than 5% of Nigerians today have access to health insurance. So the other 95% have not come in within the understanding of the law. So there should be steps to start awareness creation, education and sensitization, and of course, over a period of time, to start enforcement. And then we said FGN should immediately activate the vulnerable group fund, the vulnerable group fund for indigent and poor Nigerians. Considering that increased taxes on cigarette, tobacco, and alcoholic beverages are justified by reference to health dangers of overconsumption or consumption, it's pertinent to recommend that the accruing revenue be targeted to the health sector, especially the vulnerable group fund, to be used in paying the premiums of the poorest of the poor and most vulnerable. Then the National Housing Fund, it's been there since the Babangida days. Workers suffer 2.5% deduction, but less than 2% of the contributors have ever accessed facilities under this fund to get their own houses. Our recommendation is that it be reorganized, the management be reorganized to guarantee that contributors benefit from the fund, and of course increasing the financial resources available to the fund. The 10th one is about security. I don't need to belabor that. Everybody knows that the security challenge has even contributed in no small measure to the economic crisis we are facing. Food security is no longer guaranteed because farmers can no longer farm and harvest and contribute their own quota. And you see that the food index in inflation is even the highest one, 23.something%, as against the normal inflation rate of about 20. So we are asking for deployment of kinetic and hardcore military power to engage terrorists and insurgents. Of course, the soft power as well, the radicalization, negotiation, job creation to get participants out of criminal proceedings. Of course, implement law reforms for state and local policing. These are all part of what should be the constitutional amendment process. A critical one is on diaspora resources. In 2020, Nigeria got 72.1 billion from the diaspora in terms of remittances. And in 2021, it rose by 11.2% to $19.2 billion. And this is more than the money that comes in from crude oil sales. Crude oil sales are reached about 10, 11, 12, 13 billion now. So the dollar inflow we have into the economy from our brothers and sisters out of the country is even more than what actually comes in through crude oil sales in terms of dollars. And we're in dire need of foreign investors or investors generally and foreign exchange. Available evidence indicates that what they send home is not more than 10 to 15% of their resources. And that money is mainly for welfare, taking charge of aged parents, brothers and sisters, their school fees and housekeeping money. So we are saying, in terms of recommendations, is it possible to develop a coherent policy framework for harnessing diaspora remittances for investment? For instance, at some point we are looking for money for tranche 7 or so of the gas investments, NLNG, we had in Port Harcourt and River State. And the NLNG, the way it's structured, federal government has only 49%. The international financiers have 51%. So for every profit made from our resources, they will even take more and they will ship it out of the country. Is it possible to get Nigerians in the diaspora to bring their money and invest and take these critical components of this share so that even if the profit is made, it's likely they will retain it because they are Nigerians. A good chunk of it will still be back in Nigeria. So while federal government will get, our citizens will get, And all they need is transparency and accountability. To tell them that their money will not get lost. Because many of them have enough resources to invest, but they don't believe in the way and manner the government is run back home. We are even suggesting that create special purpose vehicles, because international investment firms may set a target to say, if you want to invest, you will invest a minimum of $100,000 or $200,000. They may not want to collect the 5 and 10,000, which is like retail money. But a special purpose vehicle, Nigeria devices, understanding our citizens, we could even set it as low as $5,000, $10,000. All right? All you need is thousands of people bringing that money for it to run into millions. And the profit you get from the investment will depend on how much you contributed. So if we do this very well, we can harness diaspora resources to develop our infrastructure and other investment needs. Debt. Everybody knows that we are so indebted, but what we have not done is that we have not added the figures properly. If you go to the website of the budget office, the debt management office, as at the end of June, they said we are owing 42.845 trillion, which is 130 billion. 42.845 is in trillion is in naira. It translates to $130.312 billion. But this excludes the 20 trillion in ways and means, which they took from the central bank. So if you add it to the 42, it gives you 62.845 trillion. It's part of the debt because we are making provision for payback in each project. And in dollar terms, it is $151.538 billion. That's our total debt today. So let's not talk about 103, that's to deceive the uninitiated. And you all know that our debt service has exceeded our income. So what are our recommendations? A moratorium on new debts, except there are exceptional circumstances justifying the new debt, and this should be done in accordance with the provisions of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Set a debt ceiling in accordance with Section 42 of the FRA, and this ceiling should no longer be defined in the context of debt to GDP. It should be debt to revenue, because you don't use GDP to pay back debt. We are discussing of the revenue available to us. And we need to redefine the purpose of borrowing in clear terms so that we use them to promote value chain development, improving the macroeconomic framework, develop infrastructure, and build strategic human capital. So this may involve an amendment of the 2021 Finance Act, which introduced an omnibus term called national interest as a justification for borrowing. When they have borrowed and ran out of ideas, they knew they were violating the Fiscal Responsibility Act. They now, in Finance Act 2021, introduced an omnibus clause called national interest. And it is nowhere defined in the body of the law. So national interest is whatever the president and the finance minister define as national interest. That should not be. So to continue borrowing for recurrent expenditure is not the way to go. And we should have a public review mechanism where civil society and the private sector should be involved through a cost-benefit analysis of loans and their implications before government takes a final decision. So the summary of the key recommendations is to stop oil theft. If we stop that as of today, on the conservative side, 6.272 trillion can be saved. And then, if we go back even to 35 million liters a day, which was the consumption, which Bros found out to be fraudulent as of 2015, we are also going to save quite some trillions. If you cut fuel subsidy by 50%, we are going to save 3.36 trillion. If you reduce tax expenditure by 90%, we are going to save about 4 trillion. If you do mandatory use of TSA for all UEs, we are going to save about 1 trillion. I'm pointing this out because we are saying we have 11 trillion deficit. So I've shown you 4 trillion, I've shown you another 3, which is 7, I've shown you another one, which is 8, and I've shown you another 14.4 is 6, 8 point plus 6. So we practically showed about 14 trillion, which could be used to reduce the deficit, and we could even have a surplus of 3 points. something trillion at the end of the day. So gentlemen and ladies, these are the key issues recommended by ActionAid, Christian Aid, BudgiT and CSJ in response to the MTEF and Fiscal Strategy paper. As at yesterday's afternoon, we've delivered copies to the chairman of the Finance Committee in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, to the Speaker of the House of Reps, and the Senate President. We also sent a copy to the Honorable Minister for Finance and the National Budget and Planning, as well as the DG of the Budget Office of the Federation. Thank you.